In 1952, she had just been, I don't know what month that was, but in November of 52, Eisenhower appointed her his ambassador to Rome, to Italy. Not to the Vatican, but to Italy. And she had always wanted a position like that because she loved Italy. She happened to have been there many times. She went during the war a couple of times, and also as a tourist. But he appointed her in November, and she began to serve the following April of 53. But the book doesn't begin there. The last book ended where she was elected to Congress, and the current book, Price of Fame, describes her arrival at Union Station in January of 1943 as representative from Fairfield County, Connecticut. I don't know if it's about worthiness. I think it's more about interest. She was just such a multifaceted person, had so many accomplishments, too many for her own good, really, because of also a lack of what you would call the imprimatur. She used to call it the American Express card. She never got a university degree. She was always afraid in every job she was going to be found out that she wasn't qualified for it, which was, of course, not true. But that's, I think, why she changed profession so often. So I'm writing really about a woman with something like 9 lives, not just one. I didn't intend 2 volumes, but I just got so intrigued about the process of how she got to where she got, which was to the Congress. Well, I had done most of the research at the Library of Congress because all the papers had already been deposited there. They were mostly her public papers of her years in Congress. And I had done the research at the State Department, but the problem with the State Department was that many of the papers were still classified. So also, I had gone to Hawaii to work on Mrs. Luce's personal papers, which were legion. She kept every scrap from the day she was born, practically, every scrap of paper. The earliest little scribbled notes from 3 or 4 years old. Never threw anything away. All the diaries, letters, and an analysis of herself, which she frequently wrote, were in Hawaii, and I had seen them there. And they were to be shipped to the Library of Congress for me to work on them there, because I didn't have time in 3 weeks to Xerox everything. She didn't have a machine anyway. And I waited and waited for them to come, and she was still alive, and they never came, and we thought they were lost at sea. And then when she died, I had got a call from somebody who was clearing out a warehouse on River Road in Washington, where she'd stowed a lot of furniture she didn't need at her apartment in the Watergate. And he said, "Sylvia, you won't believe this. That trunk with all the papers is here. It's clearly labeled Library of Congress, but it was misshipped to the warehouse." So I thought they were lost, and I was really desperate because all the really important stuff was in that trunk. It was the personal stuff which gave you an idea of the real Clare. And that's why the book took so long, and I think other biographers will tell you the same thing. I know there's a new book of letters of Robert Frost, and they say so much more stuff in it now than the original edition of his letters. Time goes by and more stuff surfaces. Well, she began by wanting to be an actress because she liked the glamorous life. She liked being in front of the camera or on the stage. And also she liked the fact that actresses, if they were successful, became wealthy. And her mother, who had always thought that money was the most important thing in the world because she didn't have any, encouraged that. And when she was just, before she was in her teens, she got a part understudying Mary Pickford, of all people, in a Broadway play. So she got a taste for life behind the footlights. And then she was a major character as some 13-year-old in a Thomas Edison movie. She went out to New Jersey and made this film called Heart of a Waif. And she played the best friend of the waif. And but the thing was, she really wasn't an actress. I think she was a bit too concerned with her own persona rather than the persona of the person she was supposed to be playing. So she realized maybe her real talent was for writing for the theater and for the movies. So she quickly started to write plays in her teens. And by the time she was, I'd say 33 years old, she'd had this immense, she'd written one melodrama which was a flop about her first marriage called Abide With Me. And then she had this immense success, The Women, which went on to become a major film directed by George Cukor and starring Rosalind Russell and Joan Fontaine and Paulette Goddard. It was really tremendous. No, she died actually in Washington and is buried at, it was a plantation actually in South Carolina, near what was called Monk's Corner, because that's a sort of irony, because in the end she and Henry Luce, who actually paid for the plantation, she persuaded him, after she converted to Catholicism, to give it to the Trappist monks. And so she's buried there. It's still a monastery. And Henry Luce put it in his will that he wanted to be buried there too, even though he was a Presbyterian. And she didn't know that until she saw the will. And her daughter, who was killed, is buried there, and her mother, who was also killed, both in car accidents. Her father began wanting to be a violinist, but with a name like William Booth, it was hard to make it in that field in those days of music if you didn't have a foreign-sounding name in America. So he never had much success. So he went into the music business, the manufacturing of pianos, at which he was quite successful in Philadelphia for many years. Then the piano business hit hard times, and he was a victim of that. So he became a patent medicine salesman by the time Clare was born. I never found evidence that the parents were actually married. I went all over America in every place they lived, and I could never find a marriage certificate. And then I found a letter that she wrote to Harry at one rather sad period of her life, and she said, "I was born probably illegitimate." And in later years, she always claimed she was born on Riverside Drive in New York City, but actually she was born in Spanish Harlem, which was a less salubrious part of town in those days. She did. One of her early lovers was Bernard Baruch, who was a so-called advisor to FDR, but I don't know how much he did actually advise him. And he was a speculator on Wall Street, extremely wealthy man, but married with children. And he fell in love with her, and she became quite besotted with him. He was much older than she was, of course. And he was a Democrat, and he took her to the 1932 convention where FDR was nominated and then went on to become president. So for many years she followed that philosophy of life, the more liberal. But she said after she married Henry Luce, there was no way you could be married to Henry Luce and not be a Republican, because you'd just have nothing but arguments in the House. So she converted at that point. But as you probably found when you read The Price of Fame, her voting record in Congress as a Republican from Connecticut was extremely liberal. She was for immigration of Chinese and Indians. She was against the colonial powers like Britain. She was very much pro the GI Bill so that they could get education. And she was also what was the other thing? Yes, fiscally, rather more generous toward people who didn't have anything. Thought the taxes should be raised on the rich, of whom she was one. Because she got more conservative as she got older, I think it was Gore Vidal commented on a remark in my first volume. I said that Clare became more conservative once she had more to conserve. In other words, when she got rich herself. Her first marriage lasted for 6 years. It was to a Fifth Avenue millionaire his father made his fortune during the Civil War making Civil War uniforms. And he was more than twice her age. He was 44 years old, she was 20 when they married. Her mother wanted her to marry rich. She tried to marry her off to the Prince of Wales, for example. Well, Henry Luce, she married, after he got his divorce, they married in 1935, and he died in 1967. So they were married, they stayed married, although it was a troubled marriage in many ways. It was not a sexual relationship after the first couple of years, because he had problems anyway, physically, but also he put her on such a pedestal that she was like the Madonna figure, and he found it very hard to have sexual relations with her. She was in Congress for 2 terms, 1943 to 46. What did she do? Well, it was not a voting record that was stellar, which she was happy to, well, not happy, but candid enough to say when she made her last speech in Congress. Because, of course, it was a Democratic Congress, so it was very difficult for a Republican to get things through. after she left Congress, well, she was hoping to go back to the theatre, because by then she'd had 3 Broadway hits. All 3 were made into movies, and all were successful. And she hoped to go back, but she found that the kind of plays that she wrote, which were satirical, rather acidic wit, she found that hard to do after she'd seen what she'd seen in World War II. And so her particular gift was that. So to go back to writing melodrama or even tragedies, she wasn't really equipped to do, but she simply couldn't write the funny comedies anymore. And she then went on the lecture circuit. She used to do a lot of public speaking, and then she converted to Catholicism, went on the Catholic lecture circuit for many years, and then she got back into writing through the movies. She went back to Hollywood, and she'd already written a play about China there before she went to Congress, but it was never made. That never was made into a movie, but in her 40s, she went there and she tried to convert C.S. Lewis's The Screwtape Letters, which you know is about 2 devils who correspond. One devil is trying to convert the other to be more effective in even making Christians sinful. I think the major reason was, she said she felt that her life had grown crummy. And I think a lot of it was because of the war. She was so disillusioned with human nature over the horror she'd seen, because she was at the opening of the camps, as you probably know. She was at Buchenwald. And so then when her daughter was killed, she got into such a deep depression to be suicidal. It was a really ironic death in a way, because Claire was speaking in San Francisco, and Anne, her name was Anne, was a student at Stanford. And she went up to see her mother in San Francisco, and they stayed the night together, and they had dinner. And Claire was always a late sleeper, because she was always up half the night writing, so she usually slept late. So she said, "Oh, darling, tomorrow," she said, "you go on ahead back to the campus, and I will join you there for lunch." So Anne catched a ride with a friend of hers who had a little convertible car, and they drove down to Palo Alto together. And it was just approaching 9 o'clock, and out of a side street came a car which was going at a tremendous speed. It was somebody late for work. And as they crossed the intersection, he hit the rear end of their car, sent the car spinning. The doors opened, and Anne was thrown out against a tree, and the car careened into the tree and squashed her against it. 19. And she was about to graduate early, so she was extremely smart. She was graduating from Stanford that spring. She was killed in January. It's a dichotomy, that, isn't it? People really want to be faithful, I think, in their relationships, but the sexual urge, I suppose, is very great, and the opportunities arise, particularly if you're traveling and you're away from home for long stretches of time, as she was. And also, she was so beautiful and so smart and also so witty that she was just always irresistible to men. I never saw, even in old age. I gave her 80th birthday party, and Richard Cohen, the Washington columnist, was at this party, and they sat together after dinner having coffee, and at one point she began to stroke his beard, and afterwards he said, "Heavens," he said, I've never met an 80-year-old before that I wanted to leap into bed with." She had this vampish quality, a seductive quality, her entire life, and her mother had it too, so it was in the genes. But I was interested in the shot you just, because she talked about thinking, and somebody said to her, "You know, you think like a man, Mrs. Luce." She said, "Thought has no sex. One either thinks or one does not think." And she always didn't like the idea that they were always pandering to her because of her sex. Well, I spent a lot of the last 7 years of her life with her, because I moved to Washington to be close, because I had to work at the Library of Congress on the collection. But also she had an apartment at the Watergate, and I went to Hawaii to stay with her there too. And we traveled together. We even went to London for the 50th anniversary of the production of The Women at the Old Vic. And we were staying at Claridge's, and we would go back after the rehearsals. We went a week before it opened. And we were sitting at the table, and she said, "You know, There are very few plays that put on after 50 years. Well, she said, possibly Shakespeare. Yes, we got close because at one point she was staying at the Shoreham Hotel. It was before she got her Watergate apartment to buy. She'd been renting, but she was sick and she didn't have a maid. She was between maids, so she was actually alone. So she said, oh, could you stay with me? So my husband and I, we just moved in until the new help came. And so I ended up preparing her breakfast, lunch and dinner for a few days. And it was then, at that point, when I think she felt vulnerable, that she started to open up to me about her first marriage, about the death of her daughter, all the things which had really affected her life. And, well, I interviewed the lovers. Henry Luce at that point had two lovers who was at least, well, three actually. He had had a slight fling with Pamela Harriman, for example. I interviewed her. Jean Dalrymple, who was a literary agent. He had a long-time relationship with her, which she said wasn't actually consummated, but I don't know. I have no proof of that. But the third relationship certainly was that I was able to interview the subject was Lady Jean Campbell, who was really half Harry's age when their romance began. Well, he started out as straight out of Yale with a college friend called Haddon, and together they raised the money to start a magazine. At first it was going to be called Facts, and then they changed it to Time. And as we know, Time was a huge success. So he then founded Life magazine, and then not Architectural Digest, Architectural, forget the last name. But then, of course, Fortune magazine, which was about finance. But Haddon died very young, and Harry was left then with the whole company, and it just went from strength to strength. Everything had great. Oh, there's of course Sports Illustrated and People magazine subsequently. Well, it was over 100 million, but he'd already given a lot of it away because when his father died, he gave quite a lot to the Henry Winters Luce Foundation. So he didn't have quite as much money to leave as he would have done if he hadn't done that. He left his two sons 7 million. Claire got 19 million. Plus she got the houses and all his personal effects. And the rest went to timing. The houses, at that point, they had a house. At the end, they had houses in Connecticut, Richfield, Connecticut, Phoenix, Arizona, and of course the New York apartment, usually at the Waldorf. They rented there. But they did buy an apartment toward the end of Harry's life, which she eventually sold. Yes. Harry didn't care about anything really except work. And she put him together and made sure he got good suits and things from Brooks Brothers and Abercrombie and Fitch and places like that. But once he had them on, of course, he was an incessant chain smoker. He smoked sometimes as many as 60 cigarettes a day. And he was always covered in ash, and he was always rather rumpled. And his hats got so old that she always had to go out and buy new ones for him. As for the socks, he was allergic to wool, so he always wore silk socks. But the problem was that sometimes he put odd ones on. He even went out in odd shoes on occasion because he cared so little about his appearance. And food too. He never cared what he ate. Yes, she realized at one point when she found out about the affair with Lady Jean Campbell, why do I want to cling so tenaciously to this man? Because if you look at him, he's rather rude in his manners, he's always disheveled. And then she tried to analyze it, so she wrote down a lot about his faults. Lady Jean Campbell was the granddaughter of Lord Beaverbrook, who was the English press lord. Actually, he was from Canada, but he went and founded the Daily Mail and the Evening Standard. And he was knighted, he became Lord Beaverbrook. And Lady Jean's parents had multiple divorces, and she was pretty much a neglected child, so she clung to her grandfather, and she lived a lot of the time of her life with her grandfather, who had a house in Jamaica. Of course, he kept a house in Brunswick, New Brunswick in Canada, and also a country house and a London apartment. So she really was used to a luxurious life, but she actually didn't have any money of her own until he died, her grandfather, and he left her £500,000, which seemed like a lot then, but of course as she grew older, it was worth less and less. But anyway, Harry and Clare first met her in Jamaica when they went to stay with Lord Beaverbrook. And she was then just like 22 years old or so. Peachy-cheeked girl with dark hair and a lovely smile. And highly intelligent. And then as the years went by, Harry would go to Europe alone without Clare, because she was in the Congress or in Rome. And he would meet Lady Jean at her grandfather's houses on the Riviera or London or wherever. And at one point he just fell in love with her, came back home and told his then confidant, who was a woman called Mary Bancroft, who was the daughter of the founder of the Wall Street Journal, who he used to confide in. She would like to have had an affair, but he never did with her. And he said, I really like this girl and I want to marry her. So he really wanted to divorce Clare and marry this 29-year-old girl. He was then in his 50s. And, well, I don't know whether to give away the plot too much, but Clare went into a heavy depression and attempted suicide. And he realized that it was just he couldn't be responsible for that. But the affair continued off and on over many years. It had been going on for 3 years before Clare even found out about it. So it was really a true love story, particularly on Lady Jean's part. And she was so devastated that when he told her, finally, we can't be together, not as man and wife anyway, and she wanted to have children, so she didn't want to continue the affair. So in a rash moment, she went to a party given by Gore Vidal and met Norman Mailer, and immediately got pregnant by him and eventually married him. It was a short-lived marriage, only lasted a year. But Harry always told her, he said, you know, if you ever see my picture on the cover of Time magazine, you'll know I'm dead. And she was so trying to get over still her love for Henry Luce that she took a cruise around the world. She got off the ship in Fiji and went into a drugstore and saw on the newsstand there a copy of Time magazine with his picture on the cover. So she knew that he'd died. That's how she found out. Clare, people think she was to the manner born because she had really rather cultivated, almost British tones to her voice. But I think Clare was nothing if not theatrical. So she always had that thing where she could imitate people. And I think she just decided that she was going to speak like an aristocratic Brit. Yes, she would also, sometimes she would just be funny and do accents and things like that. But she always spoke pretty well, as you see her speak publicly. It's interesting how she talks about we lost China, like we ever owned it. And we're talking now about we lost Iraq. We never owned Iraq. It was the way they thought then. They thought anybody who became communist was really lost to civilization. I think that's how she meant the word lost to be seen. Yes. She, well, because she gave a lot of money to Ike's campaign, and so did Henry Luce. It was usually his money when the gifts were given, but she would always say, well, I contributed to the campaign, but it was usually from Harry's pocket. And they both expected to be rewarded, I think, with a post. Harry would like to have been Secretary of State. He always had illusions of grandeur in that department. But, of course, he was not political by nature. He couldn't hold babies and just be playful on the campaign trail. There was no way he would ever become a politician. So it was left to her. And she was summoned by Ike when he had an office at the Commodore Hotel after the campaign ended, and he was then having to appoint people to the UN and to all these diplomatic posts, and he summoned her. And she didn't know, at first she didn't know what he was going to offer. He said, would she like to be Secretary of Labour? Because the first woman cabinet minister under FDR had been Secretary of Labour. And she said, well, you know, I always realized when I was in the Congress that I wasn't too good handling the union, so I wouldn't be a good candidate for that. And she said, well, London would be nice, but I believe it's already been given. He said, yes, the Aldriches do have that. And he said, well, what about Rome? And that was what was secretly what she was hoping for. And she got it. First woman to hold a major diplomatic post. They had been women ambassadors to post before, but Luxembourg, Norway, minor posts, not one of the big 3 or 4. You can see from that why he and Clare got on so well. They're both theatrical. She was the longest convert that he had ever worked with. It took the longest time, because she was so intellectually brilliant that she had to have all the answers to everything before she could convert. Even Evelyn Waugh, who was no slouch in the intellectual department, only took 3 weeks, I believe, for his conversion. Clare took many, many months. And very close, and he always adored her, and he always said that she was the smartest woman that he'd ever had to teach the catechism to. Yes, Father Murray, another great intellectual priest too. He, in fact, saved her life, literally, because one of her suicide attempts took place when he was in the house. And either she did it then because she hoped to be rescued, we don't know, but he then became really her savior at that point, and also he watched her very closely from then on, and was very instrumental in, I think, keeping the marriage to Harry from going all the way to divorce. Well, it began, LSD, in the late 50s because people thought that this particular drug was going to be very useful in treating schizophrenics, depressives, prisoners, criminals. They thought it was a benign drug at the beginning, and many experiments were made. And one doctor in particular, who worked with the Veterans Bureau Veterans Hospital in California, Dr. Sidney Cohen, was interested also not only in its effects on criminals or schizophrenics, but also on people of high intellect or high creativity, creative people. So Clare, of course, was a candidate for that. She always said subsequently that she'd actually been part of his program, but she actually was not part of Cohen's program per se. She got the drug through a man who sometimes worked with Cohen, who wasn't a doctor, called Gerald Hurd, a British philosopher, who was also very interested in the beneficial effects of the drug. And it was he and his partner who administered it to Clare. She only later on got the drug from Cohen, but you couldn't buy it in the early days. You could only get it from a laboratory in Switzerland, and it was free. It was not, you couldn't purchase it until much later. And it was only, of course, when people did begin to buy it and have bad trips and jump out of windows and everything, that in '65, I think it was made illegal. And Clare didn't take it after that, but she took it for several years before. She had good trips, and she quite liked it. No, she didn't, but her stepson, Hank Luce, had a really bad trip. Never wanted to do it again. Harry had quite a benign trip a couple of times. He imagined he was conducting an orchestra. See, the man in control. He had that fantasy. Not in Washington. Leaving Washington actually broke my heart, because I loved that house on Capitol Hill. But after 9/11, as we know, the world irrevocably changed. And the Hill became like an armed camp. Everybody in the Congress and the Supreme Court, we lived right behind the Hart Building and the Supreme Court, and right alongside the Library of Congress. It became like an armed camp because they started to close off the streets. And neither Edmund, my husband, nor I wanted to live that way. Though I don't think I wanted to really be buried from that house. But we left, and we always had an apartment in New York. It was our first base. And we found a house in Connecticut that happened to have a concrete basement, because by then we had accumulated between us so many papers, so many documents, some of them which are quite valuable. They were spilling over into our garage, and it wasn't safe. So this house, having this concrete basement, was a big draw for us, and we got it in Kent, Connecticut. We began in our New York apartment working back to back at 2 desks in one room, because we only had a 2-room apartment. And then when we had the house, of course, we had a different room on different floors, and the same applies in Connecticut. We have a different house. I have a study over the garage, and he has one on the upper floor of the house. And in New York now, we have a slightly bigger apartment, and it's got a little sort of balcony. It's like a minstrel's gallery apartment. You look down on the main room. So I work up on the balcony, and he works at a room at the back of the apartment. So we're quite separate. The only disadvantage, I think, of both being writers is that there's nobody free really to play the supportive role unless you're between books. And we never seem to be between books, because we always go on from one to another. And so that is the disadvantage, I would say. But of course, if you're a writer and you share that skill, It's very nice to have somebody, when you've written something and you've perfected it as much as you can, to have a final sort of take on it, and whether it's right or not, and that's an advantage. When she died, it was, I had seen her recently, and one morning at 9 o'clock the phone rang, and it was her secretary. She said Clare died in the night, and a strange thing, I had a thump in the heart. It was literally like if you're frightened when you're a little girl or something. And I rushed over to the apartment, but already the body had been taken away, so I didn't see her dead. But I'd spent much time with her in the last year of her life. It was sudden, in fact, when we took that trip to London to see the 50th anniversary production of The Women. She became uncharacteristically absent-minded. She left her purse at the theatre one night. She lost her room key at the hotel. And one morning when I went to wake her for breakfast, to pick her up for breakfast, I couldn't get her to open the door. I knocked and knocked. And when she finally came, she said she'd had to take a Valium because she couldn't sleep. So I went in and helped her dress, and I said, the trouble with you is, you know you want to do more than your body will allow now. Your brain is still fertile. And she said yes, and she said that's why I'm so sad. So we got back to America. That was November. In February she called. She said, guess what, I've got a brain tumor. And it was rapid, the growth. It didn't operate, and she died in October that year. But it was really sad to see that decline, because a woman had been so intellectually brilliant and curious. She would never lost the curiosity. She always wanted the latest gadget, and she always knew how to operate them, which I never did. So I admired her on so many fronts. Well, it was much longer. I cut 100 pages from that book, actually. I had so much material. But I knew that people didn't want doorstoppers who nobody has the time to read these big books, really. So I cut it to 600 pages. It still has, I think, 100 pages of back matter. The end notes are still quite dense. Well, I wrote the last word on July the 25th last year, and it took almost a whole year to publish the book. You know, the copy editing, the getting of pictures. There are 80 pictures, I believe, in the book, and you have to get so many permissions now, too. Everybody you quote, it's not, if they're dead, you have to get permission from their ancestors. And in some cases, for example, General Willoughby, who Clare had the affair with, he was General MacArthur's chief of intelligence. He never married early in his life. He only married after Clare wouldn't marry him. He married an older woman. He, it turned out, had an illegitimate child when he was serving in the Philippines during the war. And I had to track down that person, but she had died, and then I had to track down her grandchildren. So it took many months just to get the permissions to use the quotations that I use in the book, because you're only allowed to quote 11 words without getting permission. The only person who ever turned me down was for Volume 1, and that was a quote from a letter from Randolph Churchill, who was madly in love with Clare. And all his life he was, even though he married twice, he always proposed to Clare every time he saw her. And I had to get permission from his son, Winston Churchill Jr., who was then in the House of Commons. And I had to show him, of course, the letters that I wanted to quote. And he said no. And he was the only one. So I ended up having to paraphrase those letters and use just the 11 most crucial words from the letter without having to get permission. Julian Simpson appears in Volume 1. She met him on one of her trips to Europe, where her mother was trying to marry her off to European royalty, if possible. And Clare met this dashing, handsome captain who fought in World War I. Really handsome, really good-looking. And they fell for each other, and he even hired a Rolls-Royce to drive her to the ship at Southampton. And they were quoting poetry to each other on the way down. And he came out to America to visit her. But her mother said, you know, this man is just in the army, he doesn't have any money. You've really got to marry somebody rich. And so he went home disappointed, and but they corresponded for a while, and they never saw each other until he came to America. She tried to see him during the war, when she went back to Europe to report on World War II, but he was always somewhere else. I think he got into the spy business, and he was in Palestine for a while, working for MI5 or something like that. And but he did show up in California when she was working in California, and somehow he found her there, and he was then 50 years old. And she was shocked at how much he deteriorated, of course, because in her mind's eye he was still a dashing captain with the dark hair. And he'd got a whiskey nose. He'd obviously become quite a drinker, and lots of veins in his cheeks, so she was deeply disappointed. And unbeknownst to her, he never told her that he'd actually married somebody in Australia, and that woman had died after a while. But I tracked him down and found a cousin that knew him in Australia, and he said that he actually died in the homosexual quarter of Sydney. And in his will, which I also got a copy of, Julian Simpson left his money to my dear friend, Command, somebody, and he was an admiral in the Navy. So it seems that actually part of their problem was that he was bisexual, and he was never strong enough to just come in and snatch her away and say, to hell with your mother, you know, we'll elope, because he had this dual nature, apparently. So, well, she's repeating herself, actually, because she once went to the White House during the Cuba crisis. JFK actually invited her down for a chat, because really he wasn't getting the kind of press in Time magazine that he would have liked to be getting, and he thought Clare might have some influence at the magazine. She actually didn't, as far as editorial policy was concerned. She could talk to Harry in pillow talk about various things and hope it might make his way into the magazine, but there was no guarantee. So JFK invited her down for a chat, and she, of course, began to tell him what was wrong with his Cuba policy. Why are you fighting a war in Vietnam 6,000 miles away against the communists when you won't fight Castro 90 miles off our Florida shores? And he didn't like being talked to like that, because he said to, well, Claire, you know, things look very different once you're in the White House. You can't be quite as dictatorial as you might like to be if you were outside. So that meeting didn't go well, but it was at that meeting where she said, you know, you will have to be known by a single sentence, like Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. You know, you've got to have something that you're going to be remembered for. I wonder what it's going to be. And he said, well, I'm not interested in history. I'm not interested in that. What I'm more interested in is not have to drop a nuclear bomb. I don't want to be the first president in history to drop a nuclear bomb. So it was a contentious meeting. And she's really rather repeating that idea of a single sentence identifying you or defining you. Yes, in fact, they had a romantic relationship, actually. He was married to Rose Kennedy, yes. Of course, he had many relationships. Gloria Swanson, I think, was another big love of his. But Claire met him in Europe when he was ambassador, and she went over to report on the beginnings of World War II, the phony war. She wrote a book about it called Europe in the Spring. And she stayed with him at his country place. So they go way back. And as far as Nixon was concerned, she always liked Nixon, and he liked her. And there was a moment in history, I think it was when Ike had his third serious illness, and they thought there's no way that he's going to come back from this third illness and be president, continue in the presidency. Nixon will have to take over. And then when Nixon runs again, he will probably choose Clare Boothe Luce as his running mate. So she would have been the first vice president, female. But as we know, it didn't turn out that way. I came back, and then Nixon got defeated against JFK. But it's well within the realm of possibility. And then when Nixon wrote his memoir, he said the one person, he said, who could have been president of this country, who was a woman, was Clare Boothe Luce. She had all the qualifications. Yes, Hank Luce, Harry's son, married as his, was his second wife, a woman who'd been married to Mr. Hurt, and she had two sons, John and William Hurt. And it was William who went on to be the great movie star. I think he's a fantastic actor, actually, William Hurt, and that became her step-grandson, I suppose you'd say. No, because I've spent the whole year finishing this one way and another. So, and now I'm on the road publicizing it, and that'll go on more or less to the end of the year. My theory, really, about biography is that the subject finds you in some strange way. It happened with my husband several times, and it happened to me both times too. My two books, one on Edith Roosevelt and one on Clare. It was one of those accidents of history. With me? Well, my husband was writing a biography of Theodore Roosevelt, and when I was helping him type on the old typewriters in the old days, I used to help him type them up. I said, you know, you don't have much in this book about the wife, the second wife. And he said, well, there's nothing known about her. So it was like throwing down the gauntlet to me. I said, well, there must be something. And then that's when I started to investigate her, and I found a lot of correspondence from her in various barns in Connecticut and in Long Island and everything. It was a character waiting to be discovered. That was in '74. And Lawrence was very hard up, and she'd actually asked Clare if she could borrow $10,000. And Clare said, well, I don't think you'll be able to pay me back, so I can't give you $10,000, but I'll give you $2,500. And she went off and wrote that article for Esquire magazine, which largely shows Clare in rather a bad light. Yes. You get it right there, don't you? The women who didn't, many of whom didn't like her, or were envious of her. A lot of it is envy. And the men who all were totally seduced by her, including Churchill, who actually taught her to paint. He sent her a first painting set. They became quite good friends. Well, that's for debate, because Carlos Chavez was the most brilliant Mexican composer who ever lived, and actually could be seen one of the most brilliant composers anywhere, and a brilliant conductor too. And they met at the Uffizi Gallery in Rome, where Clare was indulging her love of that country, and she was standing there looking at a Renaissance painting, and he came and stood beside her and started a conversation. Turned out he lived in New York in the 20s and was quite a close friend of Aaron Copland and many other American modern composers, and he'd even conducted the NBC Symphony Orchestra. So this was a well-traveled, well-known musician. And he fell in love with her. She went to visit him in Mexico, but he had a wife who was a concert pianist and 2 or 3, I think it was 3 children at that point. And he said, you know, we cannot be lovers, we cannot marry. But he still remained besotted with her, and the friendship continued until the late 70s when he died. They corresponded, and he would come to see her when he came to conduct. And he ended up writing a symphony dedicated to her daughter, which Clare commissioned and paid him $3,000. And it's Symphony No. 3, which is now considered actually his best work. And it's the one dedicated to Anne Clare Brokaw. With her, a high spot, I think, would be when I went to see the plays with her. We went to Canada to see a production of The Women put on at the Shakespeare Festival in Canada. And then, of course, that highlight would have been seeing the women at the Old Vic. I think her death is the moment I most regret, because I admired her so much, and she had her faults. She was narcissistic, and she would be the first to admit that. But it could be a monster too. But overall, I think you just had to admire her accomplishments, considering where she started out.